Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Tawat Hami and these are the headlines. Israeli security forces and Hezbollah fighters have traded fire across the Lebanon border. In a statement, the Israel Defense Forces said that they fired on 4 Hezbollah fighters who crossed the border near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. No casualties were reported from either side. The area has been tense for days after a Hezbollah fighter was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Syria. A UN report says raging violence in Afghanistan has left 1,282 civilians dead and over 2,100 injured in the first half of 2020. The mid-year report by the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan attributed 43% of the total casualties to Taliban attacks, while Afghan forces were responsible for 23% of the casualties. The report shows 13% reduction in the casualties compared to the same period last year. In Iraq, at least 2 protesters have been killed and dozens wounded in Baghdad during renewed demonstrations against corruption and unemployment. It is the first such a deadly incident for months at Tahrir Square, which became a symbol of anti-government demonstrations last year. Nearly 500 people were killed during last year's protests. Those were the headlines and detailed stories right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Israeli security forces and Hezbollah fighters have traded fire across the Lebanon border. In a statement, the Israel Defense Forces said that they fired on 4 Hezbollah fighters who crossed the border near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. No casualties were reported from either side. Following the clash, authorities imposed a lockdown in Golan Heights. The United Nations has called for maximum restraint at the Israeli-Lebanon border. The area has been tense for days after a Hezbollah fighter was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Syria. Israel and Hezbollah are bitter enemies who fought a month-long war in 2006 that led to the killing of 1,191 people in Lebanon. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli settlers have desecrated a mosque in a suspected arson and vandalism attack. Residents said the attackers sprayed anti-Arab slogans and racist graffiti on the walls of a mosque in the Al-Bira city. The Palestinian Emergency Services said a part of Al-Bir and Al-Sahan mosque has been burnt. He said fire erupted after flammable liquid was poured through a smashed window before dawn. He said residents living near the mosque and the firefighters extinguished the flames. During a cabinet meeting, Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh has held Israeli government responsible for the attack.
We condemn the crime of occupiers, the burning of Al-Bir and Al-Ihsan Mosque in the city of Al-Bira, and the writing of racist slogans on the walls of the mosque during the dawn of this day. This is the racist and a criminal act, and we hold the occupation state responsible and the responsibility of unbridled settlers and their increased violence.
The Taliban say they will not start the inter-Afghan talks unless all of the 5,000 prisoners in the list given to Kabul are freed. In an interview, the group's political chief, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, said results of implementation of the Doha Agreement with the US have been positive so far. But he said the group will take necessary decisions if Washington fails to pull out of Afghanistan according to the agreed timetable. Under the US-Taliban peace deal, the Afghan government has so far released 4,245 prisoners. In exchange, the Taliban have released over 860 government hostages out of 1,000 mentioned in the agreement. The United Nations says raging violence in Afghanistan has left 1,282 civilians dead and over 2,100 injured in the first half of 2020. The mid-year report by the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan attributed 43% of the total casualties to the Taliban, while Afghan forces were responsible for 23% of the casualties. The report shows 13% fall in the casualties in comparison to the same period last year. This comes as the Afghan government and the Taliban are engaged in prisoners exchange process under the Doha peace deal. The Afghan government has so far released over 4,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for nearly 700 security personnel. Two sides are required to release a total of 6,000 prisoners to kickstart intra-Afghan talks. But the Taliban insist the release of all the prisoners before the start of the talks that would lead to the withdrawal of the foreign troops. The group said it will take necessary decisions if Washington fails to pull out of Afghanistan according to the agreed timetable. India has denied Kashmiri Muslims their religious right to offer the upcoming Eid al-Adha prayers in the name of COVID-19 precautionary measure. A statement for the Divisional Commissioner Office in Srinagar said all mosques shall remain closed for prayer on Eid. It said no public transport except passenger vehicles will be allowed to ply on the roads. The Indian-occupied Kashmir has been under New Delhi's lockdown and communications blackout for the past 356 days. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan says there is a visible reduction in the number of new coronavirus cases and deaths in the country. Addressing the media, Khan defended his government's policy of imposing smart lockdowns to keep the economy running. But he warned that the cases may rise again if people don't follow precautionary measures, especially on Eid holidays. The Prime Minister urged people to continue wearing face masks to ward off the disease. Pakistan has reported 5,842 deaths among over 274,000 infections so far. In the US, the number of daily new coronavirus cases has dipped under 60,000 after 10 days with 543 fatalities. Death toll in America has climbed to almost 147,000 with over 4.2 million infected. Brazil has reported 555 more fatalities after over 24,000 new cases, taking the death tally to over 87,000. Over 649,000 people have been killed by the virus worldwide, while nearly 16.2 million have been infected. More in this report.
The second wave of the new coronavirus, after surging in the Americas, Africa and parts of Asia, is now gripping Europe. Healthcare facilities in the US are beyond overwhelmed, with tens of thousands new cases sprouting every day. Mexico and Brazil are no different, with a combined tally of over 30,000 new COVID patients emerging every 24 hours. While Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro continues to defy the need for any restrictive measures, even tourists believe this approach is a recipe for disaster.
An assessment of the situation should have been done on whether the virus could be controlled or with the vaccine. If you don't have it and people can get infected, then it is a matter of safety.
The recent surge in Spain has sent alarm bells ringing through Europe as other regional countries follow UK's step of reimposing travel restrictions on the country. But Spain has called this an overreaction, saying it will negotiate with UK to exclude the Balearic Islands and the Canary Islands from the restrictions. Morocco too has reported its highest case count after months as the second wave hits the country. Australia's second most populous state of Victoria logged more deaths and a record daily increase of new cases. Premier Daniel Andrews says if people don't get themselves tested in time, the situation can get worse.
It's just a matter of fact we have too many people who have symptoms and they are going to work. And what that means, even with mask wearing, even with hand hygiene, even with distancing, that is an unacceptable risk in terms of transmitting this virus.
China recorded 61 new cases, the highest daily figure since April, due to clusters in 3 separate regions that have sparked fears of a fresh wave. Meanwhile, South Korea's new coronavirus cases have fallen back to below 30 as imported cases dwindled from a record high over the weekend.
In Iraq, at least 2 protesters have been killed and dozens wounded in Baghdad during renewed demonstrations against corruption and unemployment. It is the first such deadly incident for months at Tahrir Square, which became a symbol of anti-government demonstrations last year. Nearly 500 people were killed during the last year's protests. The renewed wave of protests is a test for Iraq's new Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who was sworn into office in May. Al-Kadhimi has promised a dialogue with the protesters and has requested comprehensive lists of all those who have been killed in protests. Beijing says the U.S. consulate in China's southwestern city of Chengdu has been formally closed. Beijing ordered the facility to be shut in retaliation for China being ousted from its consulate in Houston, Texas by Washington. In a statement, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said the U.S. flag on the consulate has been lowered and its plaque removed. It said Chinese authorities have taken possession of the premises. Beijing says closing the consulate is a legitimate and necessary response to unreasonable measure by the United States. The Foreign Ministry also alleged some American staff at the consulate interfered in China's internal affairs and endangered its security and interests. Hong Kong has announced a ban on gatherings of more than 2 people, restaurant dining and mandated face masks in all the public places. Chief Secretary Matthew Chong says the steps have been taken to curb a surge in coronavirus cases. The measures, which take effect from Wednesday, are the first time the city has completely banned dining in the restaurants. Since late January, more than 2,600 people have been infected in Hong Kong, 20 of whom have died. During the last 24 hours, China has reported 61 new cases, sending alarm bells for greater prevention and control measures. Germany has rejected a proposal by US President Donald Trump to invite Russian President Vladimir Putin back into G7. In an interview, Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said Moscow needs to actively solve the conflict in Crimea and eastern Ukraine first. Maas described the relationship with Russia as currently difficult in many areas. He said Moscow's unrelenting disrespect of international rules and norms is why it remains outside of the G7 and will continue to remain out. But he said Germany needs to Russia to solve conflicts such as conflicts in Syria and Libya. Trump raised the prospect of invitation last month following Russia's expulsion from the bloc in 2014 when it annexed Crimea. The Ukrainian army said Moscow-backed separatists have breached a tense ceasefire in eastern Ukraine just hours after it began. In a statement, the Ukrainian military said the enemy opened fire on the position of its troops, but the separatists denied the accusation and said the claims were aimed at destabilizing the situation. The truce was agreed last week by negotiators from Ukraine, Russia, and International Monitor Group OSCE. In Russia's eastern city of Khabarovsk, for the third weekend in a row, hundreds gathered to demonstrate against the arrest of provincial ex-governor Sergei Furgal. The weekend's protests were reportedly the largest to have taken place over the past week. These included chants of freedom for Furgal, "This is our region," and "Away with Putin." Sergei Furgal is now in jail in Moscow on charges of attempted murder and ordering 2 contract killings some 15 years ago. Supporters say the charges are politically motivated. Furgal, who denies the allegations, beat a pro-Kremlin candidate in an election nearly 2 years ago. In the US, Black Lives protests continue to rage across numerous cities for the 60th day, with dozens of arrests being made. Police arrested 45 people in Seattle as 21 officers got injured in clashes with the protesters. Elsewhere, the body of civil rights and US Representative John Lewis made its final journey over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The bridge became a landmark in the fight for racial justice when Lewis and other civil rights marchers were beaten there 55 years ago on Bloody Sunday. Meanwhile, several marchers in Louisville, Kentucky, to protest the killing of Breonna Taylor. Protests against systematic racism and police violence have engulfed the country since the custodial murder of African-American George Floyd in May. Thousands of Israelis have joined nationwide demonstrations over the weekend against the government. Demonstrators demand Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's resignation over corruption charges and his government's handling of COVID-19 pandemic. Protesters chanted slogans such as "Bibi resign," 1 million unemployed, Prime Minister, as huge crowds rallied in Tel Aviv and in other cities. Police made several arrests and deployed water cannon to dispel the protesters. Israel is witnessing a surge in unemployment as figures rise to 20% with the ongoing pandemic. Demonstrators argue the financial assistance offered by the government hasn't been nearly enough. The number of coronavirus cases has also soared since the lockdown was lifted in May, which has also come under fire. More stories to follow right after a short break. Welcome back. Pakistan has achieved another milestone in the field of science and technology. After made in Pakistan ventilators, the manufacturing of Pakistan-made drones has also been completed successfully. What in this report by our correspondent Sumaira Khan.
Pakistan's Minister for Science and Technology Fawad Chaudhry has been a strong proponent of the Made in Pakistan initiative. He pledged to turn the country into a technological power while examining locally developed multifunctional drones in Islamabad. The minister said Pakistan is set to announce its drone policy and a regulatory body soon to enhance the aerial vehicles production.
Drone will be the most important agriculture implement in coming days. So we have we had no drone policy. So we started work on drone policy. We worked with these companies. We worked with the NRTC, which is a defense production company. So now we have about 4 to 5 major private companies who are now in drone manufacturing. And we are encouraging them to come up with the new models in agriculture drones.
In the first phase, 30 drones will be delivered to police to assist sensitive surveillance. The Agricultural Department will have its share in this chunk to help authorities eliminate locust swarms.
The implementation of drone surveillance on motorway may start in 6 months. So we will have the major area of motorway covered by drones in like 6 to 8 months. So likewise, the Islamabad police will get drones in this year. So it will start this year, and I hope within 3 years we will have the major, the drones will be playing a very major role in police surveillance and agriculture side.
The minister also highlighted Pakistan's untiring efforts towards self-reliance during testing times of the coronavirus pandemic that are now being stretched to help other countries in need of medical equipment. With the significant launch of agricultural drone, officials in Pakistan are confident that Pakistan will be unstoppable and self-reliant in attaining any kind of drone technology in the days ahead. Reporting for Indus News, Sumaira Khan, Islamabad.
Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and the U.S. military chief have discussed strategic cooperation between the two nations. In a statement, Emir's office said Al Thani hosted U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley in Doha. The statement said the two sides also discussed regional developments and joint efforts to enhance security and stability of the region. Qatar hosts some 13,000 U.S. troops in Al Udeid Air Base, 30 kilometers southwest of Doha. The base is used as a central command for operations against terror groups in Iraq and Syria. On Friday, General Milley paid an unannounced visit to Israel and met with senior Israeli military and intelligence officials. In Sudan, 60 people have been killed and another 60 injured in fresh violence in the West Darfur region of Sudan. UN officials said around 500 armed men attacked Masteri town north of Beida village. UN said 20 others were killed earlier as they returned to their fields for the first time in years. Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok announced that Khartoum will be sending security forces to Darfur to protect its citizens. No group has claimed the responsibility for the attacks so far. The death toll from floods in India's northeastern Assam state has risen to 102. The state's disaster management authority said 5 deaths were recorded in the past 24 hours. Over 2.6 million people have been affected by the deluge in Assam's 27 districts. Meanwhile, in Bangladesh, the death toll in floods has surged to 119 with 8 more fatalities. Environmental experts have warned of long-term adverse impact due to the flooding in the country. The monsoon season usually falls from June to September, causing widespread death and destruction across the region every year. Gone with the Wind star and the last surviving actress of the golden age of Hollywood, Olivia de Havilland, has died at the age of 104. Her publicist said the actress died of natural causes at a home in Paris where she had lived for more than 60 years. The two-time Academy Award-winning actress also starred opposite swashbuckling Errol Flynn in a series of films starting in the 1930s. She made a lasting impression as the bashful Southern Bella Emmeline in Gone with the Wind in 1939.
Well, I love making Gone with the Wind, and the mysterious thing is that we had a feeling in those days when a film lasted 1 year and then you never saw it again, that this film would last longer. We never thought it was going to last, 60 years.
It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. A Swiss pharmaceutical company has completed the first transaction under a new humanitarian trade channel with Iran. The Swiss Humanitarian Trade Arrangement Channel to bring food and medicine to Iran started trial operations in January and is exempted from the US sanctions. In a statement, a Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs said more companies are being added after approval for further transactions. SECO did not identify the Swiss drug maker or give a value for the shipment, but said it carries cancer drugs for Iranians battling the disease. The pilot deal in January shipped to Iran cancer drugs and drugs required for organ transplants worth $2.7 million. Geneva-based bank BCP and drug maker Novartis took part in the pilot deal. China's thousands of state-owned enterprises, local governments and public institutions are expanding hiring. This comes as a record number of students graduate in a job market left reeling by the COVID-19 pandemic. Boss Zipin Research says around 8.7 million Chinese students are graduating this year, almost 500,000 more than last year. It said the private firm's job market for graduates has fallen 22%, which has created an active employment crisis in China. Beijing has warned graduates who generally enter the workforce in June or July may face a severe situation. President Xi Jinping has urged the companies to hire more people, fearing that the struggling graduates can turn into negative energy. And in football, Juventus beat Sampdoria by 2-0 to claim their 9th successive Serie A title in Turin. Cristiano Ronaldo and Federico Bernardeschi scored a goal each for Juventus. Ronaldo dedicated the title to the club's fans, particularly those that have suffered as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Juventus have become the only team to win 6 consecutive titles in one of Europe's top 5 leagues. In football, Manchester United and Chelsea have qualified for the UEFA Champions League at the expense of Leicester City. United beat Leicester 2-0 in the most important fixture of the season, while Wolves' dream of playing Europa League was demolished after losing 2-0 to Chelsea. In another match, champions Liverpool ended their historic campaign with a 3-win win against Newcastle. Aston Villa will play Premier League football next season after a draw at West Ham was enough to ensure they escaped relegation. Leicester City's Jamie Vardy ended the season as a top scorer with 23 goals. The 4th day's play of the 3rd Test match between England and West Indies has been abandoned due to rain. The West Indies are facing an uphill task of scoring another 389 runs to win the 3rd Test and series. They will need to buckle down, especially after losing 2 early wickets for just 10 runs at the end of the Day 3's play. The Whitsun Trophy will be shared in a case of draw as both teams have won a match each in the 3-match series. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.